Welcome to ODI Bites, a series of events that will address critical global challenges with key experts. We discuss Africa's handling of Covid-19 and what new approaches will need to be built between Africa, Europe and beyond. We hear from Carlos Lopes, Africa Union High Representative for Partnerships with Europe, and Marta Foresti, Director of ODI Europe. In a poll during our Africa Beyond Covid-19 webinar, we asked what the priority for recovery should be in Africa. The response was debt relief and economic stimulus to support governments, systems and capacity. What do you see as the main challenge and opportunities for economic recovery in Africa, and how will these vary across countries?
The G20 approved the moratorium for 19 African countries. Already, I think it is very little, and that the whole of Africa needs support to deal with COVID-19, not just some countries. What we can say is that the moratorium is a kind of a little dressing that does not help much, because in a year's time, when we will have to deal with economic recovery, there will be always the capital and the interests to pay. And I'm rather in favor of a cancellation of the financial obligations for 20 and 21, which is very different from the cancellation alone, so as to give a bit of oxygen to the economies in Africa. But I also propose that there is a need to have a restructuring of African debt, country by country, to reach solutions that ease the debt burden by reducing interest rates on commercial debts, which is our number one problem right now. In the most economically fragile countries, we should go even further, and I would recommend that all the debt be effectively erased. It does not represent a lot of money for the international community, but it is vital for these economies to weather the storm. The world has a duty of solidarity, as we all say, and while contributing for a better response to COVID-19 in different ways and shapes, that seems to be the one that really critically addresses some of the concerns of these fragile states. But for me, the key issue is to admit that public debt is running into trillions in a world where we have become addicted to debt. So it's not an African problem. And we have to be courageous enough to admit that this is a systemic failure. Financial orthodoxy make us believe that Africans have some sort of a management problem, when in fact the same understanding of macroeconomic equilibria does not apply to rich countries, because they can afford to print money, invade the market with stimulus packages, and therefore access cheap public debt, some even with negative yields, penalizing African financial markets, penalizing African currencies, and penalizing our risk ratings.
I would add that as well as sort of dialing up the effort, as you just suggested, in recognition also that some of the challenges that Africa is facing are also reflected elsewhere in the world, to also look a little bit sideways for the solutions. In the poll that we had at the event, these two priorities around debt relief and economic stimulus were the most popular around the audience, and then further down the list we found innovation and green recovery and other issues. And so there is slight different dynamics, two different conversations going on that at times don't seem to speak to one another. On the one hand, what country systems and economies need in the way of financial stimulus support and debt relief. On the other hand, what can work on the ground that relates to rethinking the way things are delivered, services are delivered, or jobs for the expanding youth population in Africa, and the role for innovation and technology to play a part. Now, these things cannot be seen as either or. I can see and understand where there is a sense of priority around financial stimulus and more sort of macroeconomic type responses, but we should not forget also about how to then stimulate and support local solutions, and injecting into the economies the kind of different, innovative potential, and unleash some of that potential that in Africa and elsewhere exists. And so I wonder whether in this, as we open all these debates about a global reset and the new normal, that we can have those two conversations together.
As countries and communities across Africa look to a future beyond COVID-19, how important is international cooperation? And who will be the key partners for African countries? How might engagement with Europe be genuinely reframed by mutual interests beyond aid?
Europe has to realize in its partnership with other parts of the world, including Africa, in particular with Africa, that there is no new normal to go back to. It's going to be different. COVID-19 really changes the nature of business, and it's also affecting the way we deal with partnerships. The time is now right for a complete turnaround. There is dialogue fatigue and cynicism about unilateral European initiatives, each one announced with pomp and circumstance. Instead, I think Africa really needs to be guided by a completely different relationship with Europe based on an instrument that frames the continent-to-continent partnership in a new way with agreed goals, with joint governance, with mutual accountability, with targets, serious negotiations, aspects that really have to be engaged in a different way from what we experienced up to COVID-19. And I think the EU likes to emphasize that it is the number one trading partner of Africa, number one investment partner, its top aid provider. But that is really a position that is under erosion, nor is it on one way alone, because Africa has to be recognized as Europe's third largest trading partner, just after US and China, but ahead of either Japan or India. Africa's youth population is a problem, but can also be a unique opportunity given aging of the European population. The geostrategic dynamics are changing. The interest in Africa from many new actors, China, the Gulf states, the likes of India, Russia, Turkey, etc., are going to affect the way we deal with each and every partnership. And there is a need for much more showing of deliverables based on promises and rhetoric that has been there since the year 2000 that have not been translated into tangible action. And I think the first indications that we get from COVID-19 crisis response are not very good. We can say at least they are mixed. We have, for instance, the fact that the allocated funds for development support package from the EU are only reprogramming of previously allocated funds with zero new additionality. Protectionist measures were introduced as soon as the outbreak created supply chain problems with medical equipment and protective equipment. The stimulus packages that have been introduced in Europe have a tremendous macroeconomic impact on the African landscape, and this was not acknowledged either. So we really have reasons to become a bit circumspect about what is the real intention of all the rhetoric that has been proclaimed so far.
Another way to think about it is to imagine a relationship between Africa, Europe, and beyond that is not just a relationship between the regional bodies or the member states alone. We are working closely with a network or a group of African European mayors who are coming together in their own rights with a city-to-city new partnership, in a way creating their own instruments, the way you are referring to, in terms of creating accountability, thinking of funding sources to work together towards joint solutions to address the realities of human mobility, including because of the reality of the demographic trends that you refer to. And so we could also imagine different ways in which the two continents can come together, new channels for different kinds of diplomatic relationships and partnerships that can perhaps be developed, on more equal footing from the get-go, and to some extent recognizing some of the limitations or the historical legacies of the existing partnerships that, as you mentioned, in some ways are not delivering on the ground. Now, this is not to say that one can be an alternative to the others, but it could be another way to inject a sense of urgency and need a change of direction in the relation between the two continents, in ways that can also perhaps reach out to private sectors and to other actors that also have the opportunity and the capacity to strengthen that collaborative endeavor that perhaps the traditional multilateral systems and the traditional partnerships don't deliver.
How important are local leaders, such as mayors and local policymakers, in relation to national government to help reinvigorate international cooperation?
We need the various cooperation channels to address inequality. And at the city and local level, that should start with the housing and mobility issues. I think those are the priorities, really. Transaction costs are very high in most African cities due to premature congestion, poor road infrastructure, limited formal public transport, badly regulated and unsubsidized semi-formal systems. And all of these various systems vary many urban residents that really pain to just get around. De facto mobility systems are unsafe. They are inconvenient, expensive, and I think they are a major contributor to air pollution. It also reinforces this idea that we have spatial inequalities because limited investments in ring roads and highways tend to privilege the connectivity needs of those who are already rich, rather than those who need to go to work or find a job. And I think in the post-COVID-19 recovery agenda, we'll have to give priority to this type of concerns as much as we give to health concerns that call for an establishment of some truly integrated, affordable, safe, and predictable world of mobility options that also takes into account the means that are necessary for people to have better protection from the difficulties that arise from water and sanitation difficulties and challenges that we have faced. So I think the city leaders, the local leaders will have a major role to play in this recovery period, and they will have to be responsive to the old needs, but also to the additional findings that result from COVID-19, adding to their priority list. And that's why we need a much more integrated response that also concerns central authorities, different actors in the partnership world that are going to be able to enhance these opportunities.
I think there are politically, in a number of countries, the relationship between central government and local government is not an easy one. There are very different model of local governance at play at different levels of genuine decentralization. And given what we began this conversation with and some of the issues related to the macroeconomic settings and needs, we need to be careful not to assume, the solutions cannot be all related to finding a solution at the local level, and recognize that there will always be some trade-offs and tensions between the role of national governments in the recovery and the local solutions. Having said that, I am particularly optimistic that we are seeing actually also local politicians and local policymakers really taking up the leadership challenge and really coming forward with ideas on how to address the recovery from COVID, the handling, the management of COVID, and the recovery from it. Europe has a very strong tradition of regional policies and delivering and doing policy making at the regional and local level. And this is something that could also be unleashed or can actually help to nurture that new partnership, so the renewed partnership that we were discussing a few minutes ago, where there may be solidarities and networks and partnerships between regions in Europe and in Africa, as well as between cities, that could be leveraged for a different kind of relationship, international cooperation. Because, as we said at the very beginning, going back to the old normal and the old models of international cooperation between Africa and Europe is just simply not an option at this stage. And so we need to explore all these new potentials. And I think that regional and local leaders will have a critical role to play.
Please share with us your final thoughts.
I believe policy discussions on the post-COVID-19 recovery period offer an opportunity to review the course and introduce critical sustainability dimensions. I think it is an opportune moment for leaders, civic movements, enlightened firms, think tanks, and allies in national governments to forge a policy movement to advance a green agenda, an agenda that can address climate impact, but also spatial inequality, environmental stress, social cohesion, so we can really emerge from this crisis with something that is not the same, as we used to discuss prior to it.
I think that what Africa needs is what the world needs. And I think this opportunity for all of us to reset the way policies and practices work around the notion of a collective future post and with COVID is an opportunity to reframe the nature of that, of international collaborations. And if we do not make this the opportunity to reset the partnerships at play and to really address the power imbalances that have characterized so much of international cooperation and actually have failed in so many ways, from climate to migration and now to global pandemics in the last few years, I can't think of what else will help us reframe those relationships.
Thank you for tuning in to ODI Bites. Find out more on odi.org/events.